Sony has officially won the full frame camera war. Here's why. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much once again joining me for tea time. Today we have a little bit of fireside. So good, so good. Look at that mug. Look at that mug, guys. Is that cool? The space shuttle. This mug is probably like 20 years old. I don't know. Cool stuff. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about a little bit of tech, photo, video, all rolled up into one. Sony has done it, guys. Sony has done it. They have won the camera wars. The full frame camera wars have been going on for many, many years. If you guys remember way back in the day, like 12 plus years ago, if you've been following me for that long, we used to do Digital Photography Cafe, where myself and Trevor Current, we would go to all of the different conventions. We would go to WPPI in Las Vegas. We would go to PPE, which is Photo Plus Expo in New York City at the Javits Center. So we used to do this a lot and go all around the country and cover events. And we would basically interview the movers and shakers, the CEOs, everyone that is important in the photographic and video industry. Well, way back then, this new camera came out and we saw it when we were at PPE, Photo Plus Expo, one year. And what it was the A7, the very first A7, the Sony A7, mirrorless, full frame. And there was a lot of hoopla going on, you know, the booth was just covered with people. And I remember going there with Trevor and taking a look at the camera. And of course, we're press, so they want to show us the camera and they want us, our opinion on it and to talk about it, of course, because they want publicity on it. And honestly, guys, this was the worst piece of crap I've ever seen. God honest truth. They didn't even have a Sony lens to use. They say, well, if you have a Canon EF lens, well, you could use it on it to test it, but that's really about it. And they had an adapter, an EF adapter that went onto it. So we did that, but oh my God, the autofocus, I mean, you could hear the autofocus. It was so slow and bad. I mean, it was just, this camera was an absolute piece of crap. But I remember saying at the time, I said, you know, this mirrorless thing, this might be like the next big thing to happen because it's nice to not have a little clicky click, right? You don't really need a shutter with a mirrorless camera. And if you can get that, let's say, transfer rate, the data rate fast enough, well, you might not even need a shutter anymore and still be able to do high-speed photography, do flash photography. But we knew that you couldn't do it then because it just wasn't quick enough. You would end up with banding, if you remember. Also, what happened was you ended up with a lot of this jello type of effect. And that's the rolling shutter because that's the means of capturing an image. And I'll get into that in just a second. Well, Sony has done it, guys. They've done it. I've talked about it way back then. I said, you know, whatever manufacturer comes out with a full frame global shutter is going to take the market. That is just simply it. Because we saw that there was a lot of global shutters out there that were like 4 megapixels, 8 megapixels, but it just wasn't enough. You needed at least 24 megapixels. And that's exactly what Sony did here. So I remember when the Sony A7 III came out, I started recommending it over Canon, whereas I'm a Canon shooter, right? Because I said, you know, this thing is just really unbelievably good for the money. It was just under $2,000 when it came out. It was like $1,900 and it just did a lot. It gave you a lot of value and I started recommending it. And as Sony progressed from the A7 III to the 4 to the 5, so on and so forth, the Rs with the larger megapixel sensors, I said, you know, Sony is going to be the one to beat. And Canon really needs to get their shit together. Well, it has happened, guys. Like I said, Sony now has the A9 III that does not have a rolling shutter. It is a global shutter at 24 megapixels, which is unfreaking believable. It finally happened, guys. It finally happened. So let me start out by telling you why the global shutter is so good. Because if you don't know what a global shutter is, you're like, well, what the hell are you talking about? What is a rolling shutter? What is a global shutter? I'm going to tell you what the difference is and why it is so important, right? And then I'll get into some of the specs of the A9 Mark III. If you're here just for specs of A9 Mark III, go check out another video, all right? Because I'm not going to get really deep into the specs. I'm going to tell you what they are and why they are great, but I'm not going to dive into it because right now that's all we see on the market, or not even on the market, but out in the wild is pre-production. So things change anyways, and to speculate on something pre-production that might change in the next month or two is kind of futile, right? So anyways, as far as a global shutter versus a rolling shutter, the way a rolling shutter, matter of fact, you know what? I'm going to bring up the chalkboard. You know, some of you guys like when I bring up the chalkboard. So I'm going to bring out the pen. I'm going to pull out the chalkboard and I'm going to show you what the difference between these are. All right, check this out. So, all right, let's put a red dot in the middle of the screen here. Now this red dot is going to be a ball, and this ball is going to move from left to right at an extremely high speed. Well, the way a rolling shutter works is simply like this. A scan happens of the entire sensor, and it either goes from top to bottom like this, or it'll go from left to right. Either way, let's just make believe it's coming from top to bottom. Well, as it's scanning the frame, and maybe it gets to about, well, let's say right around here. Once again, the ball is moving extremely fast. So by the time it gets the scan and it actually has captured this top section, well, the ball has probably moved already. So what happens? Let's go ahead and bring up another ball. All right, so now we have two. Well, it wouldn't look like this. Why? The reason it wouldn't look like this is because remember, the top has already been captured. So let's go ahead and cut off that top because it was captured before. And the bottom has not been captured. So on the first ball, let's cut off the bottom. Now, do you see what's happening here? This doesn't look great, right? So now we end up with the top of the ball over here, the bottom of the ball over there. And this is where we get this jello effect. So basically anything that's moving quickly in a frame will end up with this rolling shutter effect. Now, some companies like Nikon have tried to minimize rolling shutter with their Z9, but it's still there ever so slightly. It's still going to be there no matter what. If you're going to scan a sensor, doesn't really matter how fast you scan it, you're still scanning it. Just think about it, right? So as you go and capture faster and faster and faster, your frequency goes up higher and higher and higher. Eventually, it's not going to be able to capture fast enough, and you're going to end up with these anomalies. That's the same thing that happens when you capture a photograph using flash photography. Sometimes in the past, especially with very slow readout sensors, at the very beginning of mirrorless, you would see banding. A flash would go off and then there'll be like a banding, like half of the image will be really bright and then the other half will be dark. Why is that? Because the flash popped off, and as it was scanning through it, it was bright when it was capturing the top, and by the time it captured the bottom of the frame, the flash was already gone, so it was dark. Make sense? That's the same thing holds true with this ball analogy, or with a fan. Let me bring up a fan. This is a really good example. Here we see rolling shutter in its finest in comparison to a global shutter. The rolling shutter on that fan, you see how it gets warped? And the reason being is as the frequency is going off and it's not able to capture fast enough, the fan is spinning so quickly, the fan is moving before it can capture the entire frame. The difference is with a global shutter, instead of scanning over the sensor to capture the image, it captures all of the pixels just like this, frame by frame by frame. Not scan by scan by scan, the entire frame each time at very high rates of speed. Hence, you end up with no jello effect. You don't have any rolling shutter effect. There is absolutely no problem. That's why I've always said, if you have the ability to get a global shutter, get it. And that is why a lot of the cinema cameras have global shutters. But the difference is the cinema cameras today, most of them, the biggest sensors are like Super 35s, things like that. They're not a full frame global shutter unless you spend a ton of money. Well, This camera is going to be about $6,000. So this is going to be, I would say, revolutionary. Just like when Canon came out with the Canon 5D Mark II, where it was able to capture video and everyone's like, oh my God, they started using it for like TV shows like ER and stuff like that, right? It was like a big thing. It's like, oh my God, look at this. For just a couple of grand, we have this amazing cinema camera. We can capture now full frame images. Wow, the dynamic range, blah, blah, right? Well, that is the same type of wow that this global shutter is. 24 megapixel global shutter is absolutely the cat's meow. That is the number that I said. You can go back 2 years, 3 years ago. 24 megapixels was the number I said would be the perfect number to be able to have a global shutter capture, and they couldn't do it. They were only able to do 4.5 megapixels. It was really low. And a lot of the global shutters were all for commercial purposes, for doing packaging or imaging at high speed, high rate of speeds, down assembly line, that type of thing, where you can't have that jello effect, that moving shutter where it's capturing this fast. So they were small sensors. So I just think that it's absolutely amazing that Sony did it. Kudos to them. Now for me, I would have loved for Canon to have done it, but they didn't. So now they're going to have to play catch up. The same thing holds true with Nikon. Now I know there's a lot of Nikon guys out there say, oh, the Z8, the Z9, it captures so quick, the readout is so fast, you don't really need a global shutter. That's wrong. Okay, do you not get blackout? Do you not see much rolling shutter? Yes. But like I said, you will end up seeing it when you're doing extremely high rate of speed anything. All right. I saw some testing of this where someone was spinning a staff at extremely high rate of speed and there's no blur. There's no blurring. There's no bending of the staff. Right. So it was really, really quite amazing. Now, some of the points that I have to make is that it can capture at 120 frames per second, and that is full autofocus. That is amazing to me. Once again, global shutter, meaning that it has to capture all 24 million pixels, right? At this speed. That is pretty impressive. So the processor in this thing has to be twice that of its predecessor, I believe. That's the only way it's going to be able to do this. Also, I found out that the EVF in this is a 9.44 million dot EVF that sits at 120 hertz. So you're going to be able to look through that, capturing at 120 hertz, 120 frames per second, at 120 hertz, and see no blackout at all. So just motor, brrr, like that, no blackout at all. That is just amazing. What they also introduced was this C5 button, another custom button. It's right on the right-hand side of the lens on the camera. So what I would use that C5 for is to toggle like the speed of capture. So if you just needed to capture, let's say 20 frames per second, okay, go ahead. You want to capture 30 frames per second. All right, that's fine. Well, maybe you need to capture that 120 frames per second and just smash that buffer. I'll get into that in just a second. Well, you could just hold down that C5, pull the trigger and go, and just motor at 120 frames per second. Let's say you're at like some sporting event and you don't want to miss that shot, and then let go of that C5 and then go back down to your normal, whatever your normal is set to. 10 frames per second, 20 frames per second, whatever. So you're not burning through these CFast cards more or quicker than you should be. So that is a really cool addition. And I think sports photographers are going to absolutely love that. Now, getting back to buffer, my understanding is this thing will be able to capture at a lossless, a just full raw image up to 120 frames before having to download it, let's say, onto the card. Buffering, right? Whereas if you now changed it to a smaller image, you'll be able to get to like 240 frames before buffering. But bear in mind, if this thing is going to be able to do 120 frames per second, you'll be like, brr, and like 1 second later, you will be packed, right? And your camera's going to have to offload. Now, I was hearing speeds of like up to a minute to offload with just standard cards that aren't extremely fast. With the fastest cards, I think it's about 10, 20 seconds, 15 seconds to offload. So remember, if you go and you want to do that 120 frames per second, you'll be like, Now you got your 120 frames. Now you have to count out, let's just say 10 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's buffering. It's offloading these images. So you have to bear that in mind. So when you do use this, you're not going to be able to shoot for a few seconds. You're going to have to let it go and take that data and dump it to a card. That's just the way it is. Now, what's also really incredible with this camera is it'll be able to capture at 1/80,000th of a second. That is pretty damn quick. Thinking about stop motion photography, right? Capturing a bullet, this type of 1/80,000th of a second. I think that holds true with most cameras today. If you want to get the most out of your camera, buy the company's glass, right? Third party is great if you're on a budget and or you have some specific use case that might not be available, maybe some type of tilt shift lens or something, or specific telephoto or macro that is not available from your corporate glass, right? From your manufacturer. Then I can say, well, go with third party. If not, if possible, buy the manufacturer's glass. For me, Canon, most of my glass is Canon glass. Sometimes I'll get some Sigma, sometimes some Tamron. It really depends, but the majority of the glass, the important glass, will be Canon glass. The same thing holds true here with the Sony. Buy Sony glass if you can. G Master glass is awesome. All right. Also, what I find interesting here is on the video side. People don't talk about the video and a global shutter that much, besides like what I was telling you about with the ball and the movement of the ball. But what makes this so just important is when you're doing any type of cinematography and you have that helicopter or you have someone hitting that golf ball. And if you don't want to see that one wood bent up like a piece of taffy, well, you need a global shutter. All right, that's just simply the way it is. So what I see here is this thing is going to be recording 4K 60p, which is really nice. That is oversampled 6K or 4K 120p, which is also quite nice. And this is without any crop. So you're taking the entire sensor, taking all of that data, and getting 4K 120p out of it and not losing anything. Now you might be pixel binning a little bit. We can get into that in another video and whatnot, but it is still quite impressive, very impressive. Now, one of the things that is kind of concerning is that the base ISO, instead of being like 100 ISO, it's not. It is 250 ISO. So seeing that it is 250 ISO and not 100 or 160 or whatever, I'm going to speculate that the dynamic range is not going to be as good, for example, as an A7 Mark V or something. I just have a feeling it's not. And when you deal with a global shutter, you're just going to have to take the good and the bad. There's only so much that you can do. Remember, you're capturing all those millions of pixels at this speed all at once, not scanning over them, but just the entire frame. It takes a lot to be able to do that. So there has to be some sacrifice, right? And I feel that dynamic range is probably going to be one of those sacrifices. Now, is it going to be really important for everyone? I don't know. I'll get into that just a second. Now, as a point of reference, if I was to do like episodic TV or an ad spot or something like that, a lot of the cameras that we use, like for example, like a Panasonic EVA 1, just for example, well, that camera has a dual ISO built into it. What does that mean? You have two native ISOs and you could switch between the two of them. You could go from 800 native ISO to 2500 ISO, which makes a major difference in shooting in low light. All right. So it is a big deal to have a dual ISO type of setup. Now, what I found out with this A9 Mark III is it does not have this dual native ISO like a professional cinema camera would. Now, is this a problem? Now, some people would say, well, this camera is $6,000. Is there any other $6,000 full frame global shutter cinema cameras out there? Well, kind of not really. I mean, you have your Red Komodo, right? Which is a Super 35. Then you have your Z-Cam, which is also a Super 35. So, and those are both about $6,000, you know, in that price range. So I would say that if you are a cinematographer, you look at this Sony A9 Mark III. You're like, well, if this thing actually has good enough, big air quotes, dynamic range, I'll take a few of them. Think about it. $6,000 is cheap for a cinema camera, really cheap, and especially one that will capture globally, where you don't have that jello effect. You have a true cinema camera, just like you would see in a movie theater, right? For 6K. That is really, really, really cheap. So the question I'm sure you would have also is like, well, where in the hell is Nikon and where is Canon? I don't freaking know. I remember right around 2022, Nikon came out with a patent. And I was reading through the patent, I told you guys about it, and it was something that would allow them to capture both a global shutter as well as a rolling shutter with the same sensor. Some technology. Well, they patented this in 2022, but we've heard nothing about it. That's all that they have been trying to do over there at Nikon, is just simply make their system faster and faster and faster to eventually try to say, we don't need a global shutter because our processor is that fast. Now, what happened to Canon, right? The same thing. I did a story in January of 2023. What is it now? 11 months ago. And the story was about Canon having this, I think it was a 5.7K, 60 frames per second, full frame global shutter. That was one sensor. And another shutter they came out with, which was a 4.5K, but 120 frames per second, Super 35. Now, I don't give a crap about the Super 35. I really like the full frame. Okay, so a full frame they said that they had available, or they made, this was in January, which was 5.7K. Where is that? That would be very similar to this sensor. Remember, this is an oversampled 6K to get their 4K. I would say it's almost identical, right? Just think about that. But Canon has done nothing with it, just like Nikon. At least with Nikon and the Z9, for example, they made the processor so quick that they can say, listen, we don't need a global shutter. It's good enough. Now, we know good enough is not good enough, but still, it is pretty damn good. All right? Not as good as this Sony, I can guarantee you that, obviously. But still, it's pretty good. Canon didn't do any of that. So I'm going to say this. You could write this down, and then you could refer back to this video. Once again, it is speculation. I'm going to go out on a limb here. In 2024, when the Canon EOS R1 comes out, if it doesn't have a global shutter, they're screwed. That's my personal opinion. I think that it will have a global shutter. Now, why they haven't released it in 2023, I don't know. Maybe they're coming up with problems. Maybe overheating problems like they've had in the past, right? I really don't know what the story is, but if they do not have a global shutter in that R1, I think that Sony A9 Mark III is just going to continue to eat their lunch and is really going to smash their C series, their cinema line, the C100, 200, 300, the C700s, all of these cameras that I would use for cinematography, for doing like very long pieces that I don't need to worry about overheating or anything, because the camera actually has built-in cooling, active cooling, fans and whatnot. So I really do believe that a lot of these cinematographers today are going to look at this A9 Mark III as a viable option to capturing movies for $6,000. I really do believe that, affordably, because 6K is nothing in comparison to some of these cameras that are $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 and more. Some of the lenses are more than that. Okay, so I really do believe that a lot of these cinematographers that are on a budget, so to speak, will look at this camera. Once again, it will have to do with the dynamic range. If they can shoot this thing in log, there's enough dynamic range there that they can go back in post-processing and color grade this footage, and it really still looks acceptable, really well, let's say. Sony has done it. Just like I said, Sony has won the war as of right now. hands down, A9 Mark III. Obviously, it's not in the wild as of yet, or let's say pre-production or out in the wild. So we really don't know what the final numbers will look like, the dynamic range, what will it look like? What's the SNR, the signal to noise ratio? Is it clean? Is it dirty? What does the signal look like? Is it pixelated, at higher ISOs? What is it? We really don't know as of yet. But like I said from the beginning of this video, I do think that this is a game changer. I think that they have won the war as of right now. And I think they're going to sell a ton of these cameras moving forward in 2024. And like I said, if Canon doesn't come out with a R1 that has a global shutter, they're going to have some serious problems. And if Nikon doesn't do the same, which I really do think they will, they're going to end up having some problems too down the road. Because remember, the price of the cameras are the same. I guarantee you that if this is coming out at $6,000, when an R1 comes out, it's going to be like $6,499. Write it down. This is how it works, right? This is how it works. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video, even in the least, throw it a thumbs up. That'll be very helpful. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not subscribed. If you are subscribed, click this little button over here so when I go live when a new video comes out, you'll be notified of it immediately. And if you just want to say thank you for all of my hard work, there's a little thank you button down here. You can give $1 or $2 if you like. If not, that's fine too. Consider becoming a member of the channel. That would be even better. If you want any of my ebooks, they're free. Right now, they're free. Go over to JCristina.com/books. Once again, JCristina.com/books, and you can get those free. Can you beat free? Come on. Come on. Also, if you're looking for a VPN, look no further. Check out Pure VPN. The nice folks over there gave us a promo code, which is JCristina. You can get 15 additional % off at checkout, or you can use the URL jcristina.com/VPN, jcristina.com/VPN. And finally, head over to my website, jcristina.com, where you can find all the photography tools that I've invented for you and me over the years, and hopefully there's something there that you might like. And if there is, please pick it up and support me and my family. That's it, guys. I'm out of here for another vlog. Many blessings to you and your family. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next one. Love you all.